So I was born and I studied in Calcutta till my master's days. I did my master's degree in botany because I was always interested in living forms and in life. Then I went on to do a PhD in molecular biology at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai. My research was on carbohydrate metabolism in yeast. And of course you can ask, how did I come into consciousness research? It's a long story, but one of the things that bothered me at the end of my PhD was that in the biology that we were doing, especially in terms of molecular biology or biochemistry, the organism was lost. So somewhere our biology had become so reductionist that we were only focusing on molecules, on cells, on interactions of cells, but nobody was asking questions about how all of that translates into a living, breathing organism. And so I felt that lacuna, and towards the end of my PhD I started thinking that I would want to study some more complex processes, biological processes that living organisms show, but which I had till then not really inquired into. And one of the things that really interested me was the mind. I was curious about the human mind, about myself, about all my friends, my family, people I met on the streets, wondering how they thought, how they took decisions. And it occurred to me towards the end of my PhD that there must be an evolutionary biology to these decision-making processes. It could not be, as was often said, that humans were the only species that had strong cognitive abilities. This seemed to me unacceptable, and in fact if you go back to the studies of Darwin or his thinking, he talked about an essential continuity between all living organisms in various living processes, and why should consciousness or cognition be out of that gamut. So at this time I decided to start working on animal behavior with the ultimate goal of trying to understand the mind. I started my animal behavior work on social wasps, and what was extremely interesting for me, which didn't form actually a part of my original work, was that I realized that wasps have cultural traditions as well. And that was extremely surprising to me, because then you realize that these small-brained, small organisms are also complex enough to learn from each other through observation and use that learning to actually set up behavioral traditions. I then started thinking about what else I could do for the rest of my life, and I thought it would be interesting to study the evolution of cognition or cognitive abilities, and maybe later consciousness, in primates. And why primates? Because we are primates, and if I had to study an evolutionary biology of the mind, it made sense to actually study non-human primates, because that's where you would expect an evolutionary continuity. And where should I study these primates? I of course wanted to study them right here in our country. I did not want to go abroad for various other personal reasons, but more importantly, I thought it was interesting and it would be illuminating to actually study primates in the wild. Much of the studies in cognition and maybe even in the beginnings of consciousness that have happened in non-human species were confined to the laboratory. But the laboratory is clearly not the best place to study an animal, because it is completely a foreign, alien environment for it. And you would not expect animals to always express their natural behaviors in a laboratory setting. So I thought I should go back to where they have actually originally evolved and try and understand animals in terms of how they process their lives, how they take decisions, how they lead their lives basically. There again, there was a bit of a conundrum. What should I actually study? Should I study how animals live their lives in the physical space that they do? But there was also a social space that many of these animals shared. And I thought that perhaps the most illuminating experiences that individual animals have come in terms of their social interactions with other members of the species. I thought about this simply because if you look at our own lives, I think much of our cognitive abilities are harnessed in building relationships, maintaining them, and sometimes breaking down those relationships. Perhaps much more than navigating your road or deciding what you're going to eat. Those are important decisions, but those ecological decisions seem to me to be less demanding cognitively than were social decisions. And so I thought I would study a social non-human primate and try and understand the evolution of social cognitive abilities in that species. So I was planning to do this, and I had just started some work on this in the National Center for Biological Sciences right here. It was then located in the IISc campus, and I began my studies with macaques which were themselves located in the University of Agricultural Sciences. So at that time, of course, the so-called Bellary Road was just a narrow road with agricultural fields on both sides, occasional cars. I had a little moped on which I would go off to study the monkeys, and all I needed was a notepad and a pen and a pair of binoculars, and that's what I use even today. And then you realize that even with such simple methodologies in the wild, you can get tremendous insights into behavior, into decision making, into various other aspects of cognition that I was interested in. I had finished about 2.5 years or close to 3 years of work when I got a call from a certain Dr. Sangeetha Menon in the National Institute of Advanced Studies, and she asked me whether I would like to come and give a talk on animal consciousness. I, of course, had no clue about animal consciousness, and let me actually add this. At the time when we were doing these studies, which is about 20 years ago, 22 years ago, consciousness was taboo in the natural sciences. If I mentioned the word consciousness in my papers on cognition in the macaques, I was sure that those papers would get rejected. So I didn't really think too much about consciousness till I got a call from this Dr. Menon, and she said, you have to come and give us a talk on consciousness in animals. And so I feverishly prepared, and I came to NIAS, and I think that was somewhere in September or October 1996. I came and gave a talk in the central lecture hall, which is now a canteen, and it was a round table. And amongst the various people who were present other than Dr. Menon was Dr. Rajaramanna, who was of course the founder director of NIAS, and Dr. Ravi Kapoor, who was then our deputy director and a psychologist, psychiatrist of great renown. So of course I gave this talk with extreme trepidation. I was extremely nervous, but I delivered it. And it was interesting because from the response I got in the audience, it was interesting because I had never anticipated that there could be so much of discussion on what I thought was so important for me, but which the world didn't really seem to care. In fact, at that point, everybody, including my father, was really upset that I was giving up molecular biology to come and look at monkeys. But to me, that seemed to be the right thing to do, but it wasn't very clear to everyone. But when I came to NIAS and gave the talk, I saw the level of interest that the audience had in an esoteric question of how does an animal decide what to do? Is this decision conscious? How do we define consciousness? And these are questions which remain with us even today, but that really in a sense marked the beginning of my journey into consciousness research. I think about a week later, I got a call from Professor B.V. Srikanthan, who was also here. He was director of TIFR when I did my PhD there. And he called me and he said, would you like to come and see me? And when I came to see Professor Srikanthan, he asked me, would you like to continue to work in NIAS? And I thought that was fantastic. I mean, I couldn't imagine such a beautiful institute where I could come and do exactly the kind of work I could. And so he said, why don't you meet Dr. Ramanna? And he would like to have an interview with you. So I met Dr. Ramanna for an exactly 2-minute interview, during which time he said, hey, I hear you want to join this institute? And I said, sir, if you invite me or you let me, I will. He said, so are you going to study monkeys all your life? So I said, I want to study monkeys all my life. Then you can join us. Join from tomorrow. And that's how Dr. Ramanna took this decision. And I don't think, looking back, anybody could have an easier time to get into a job, which I now have. And I think, it was remarkable how all this conjunction of events happened so that I found myself in an institute where I've been working now for 22 years and completely freely. But what I would like to tell Dr. Ramanna, wherever he is that I haven't given up on the monkeys. I still work on them. Oh, I must tell you this story. So Dr. Ramanna, it was Dr. Ramanna's 75th birthday. And you remember that there used to be that little place out there where we used to have our tea morning and in evening. It was a small group of people. We had a lot of intense interactions. Times have flown, times have changed since then. And it was Dr. Ramanna's birthday and he was going to cut a cake. And so of course, as he was going to cut a cake, there was going to be a picture. And of course, all of us gathered around. And he suddenly pointed to Dr. M.D. Madhusudan, who was then just Madhu. He was my first PhD student. And he called him and said, Madhu, you come and stand next to me because you are the youngest member in this institute and I am the oldest. And then he suddenly saw me. And he said, Anindya, you come and stand on my other side because you represent all the other species in this world. So that was Dr. Ramanna. What a remarkable man. Okay, so the first question that you asked me about whether animals have consciousness, there is no simple answer to it. As Professor Srikanthan, I remember in one of his talks said, at last count, he had seen 136 definitions of consciousness because he had read 136 papers in which everybody defined consciousness differently, right? And so that's true. And I think whether animals have consciousness or not depends on how you define consciousness. And then look for the manifestations of that phenomenon in a certain species or in a certain, even an individual, maybe. Right? The other important thing is that, and something that is often lost, is that methodologically, we know another human being is conscious because he or she can tell us about what he or she is experiencing, and we gather from there that since those thoughts are similar to what we are doing and we are conscious, this individual must be conscious. The moment you come into a non-human species, that methodology fails because they cannot communicate with you. So we really do not know what a non-human animal is actually experiencing under certain circumstances, and so we have to surmise whether the animal is conscious or not by whatever definition we may have consciousness from its behavior. So at some level, therefore, at one end of the spectrum, you have these behavioral manifestations of higher cognitive processes which appear to us to be simple behaviors, but then we need to understand the genesis of those behaviors, the kind of variability those behavioral decisions can take, and from that we have to surmise what are the cognitive processes that underlie this behavior. That's a long-winded answer. A simpler answer to your question, which goes back to the earlier statement I made that the definition of consciousness depends on how you define it. According to certain philosophers, if an animal is able to sense certain stimuli in its environment and respond appropriately to it, it is conscious. So if an amoeba is swimming along and you put a drop of acid in front of its path, it stops for a while and then retracts and swims in the opposite direction. If you put in a drop of water, the amoeba doesn't do that. So clearly, here is an instance where an amoeba has sensed a certain component of its environment and has taken an appropriate decision to swim away from it. By a standard definition of consciousness, the amoeba is conscious. However, different philosophers, different biologists, psychologists put different kind of definitional sort of boundaries, and therefore there are also people who might say that only humans are truly conscious, other animals are not. But I don't agree with that, because I think part of this problem is methodological, part of this is, in a way, if I may use this word, psychological, where we still want to maintain the uniqueness of being human, where we don't really like the idea that the crow is actually in a continuum with us. Right? That's a problem. Another sort of aspect to this, and I will sort of perhaps end your first question with this, is that there are different kinds or stages of consciousness that we can define. To use a very simple dichotomous sort of definition, you have something called perceptual consciousness, where are you aware of the different components of your environment, physical, social, etc. If you call that perceptual consciousness, then I think every being, including the amoeba, right from amoeba to humans, maybe bacteria as well, perhaps not viruses, but maybe even viruses, are perceptually conscious. But then you can look at another kind of consciousness, which is slightly more complex, which is what is commonly called, let's say, reflective consciousness. If you have a particular mental state, if you have a particular thought, if you have taken a particular decision, can you reflect on that thought? Can you think about that thought? Can you think about the decision? And that is reflective consciousness, which I definitely know humans have. There seems to be some evidence that maybe chimpanzees are reflectively conscious, but we don't have very clear evidence whether any other species is reflectively conscious. But the caveat is that I know you are reflectively conscious because you tell me about certain things that you're undergoing. If I watched you for an entire month without speaking to you even once, I would be very hard pressed to establish that you think. You think about your thoughts. I see you take decisions, but those can have behavioral mechanisms. Can you think about your thoughts is something that is behaviorally extremely difficult to decipher. You decipher it very easily because you say, I'm feeling bored with this interview. So you know I'm reflective, but I don't know whether the macaque is reflective, right? Okay, and to come to the second question you asked about certain events that I've seen, certain incidences, it's actually a continuum again. I've been studying macaques now for 25 years, and I realize from my understanding of various kinds of behavioral decisions they take, the different phenomena that they display, they are conscious. What kind of consciousness will require a more perhaps involved discussion, which I don't want to do now. But let me just tell you how complex their decision-making process is. There are two macaques sitting together, grooming each other, going through each other's hair, removing ectoparasites, whatever. It's a social bonding mechanism as well. And a third macaque approaches them. One of them leaves. So we actually tried to understand which macaque leaves of the two who are sitting there. Why does she leave? Right? And what you find, and I'm just cutting this short, what we find is that when a macaque decides to leave under this circumstance, she's taking a decision. It depends on three factors. It depends on the identity of the animal who's approaching. What is the difference between them in dominance ranks? The second factor she takes into account is what is the dominance rank difference with the individual who's sitting with me? And the third thing that she takes into account, which is much more cognitively sophisticated, is am I a dominant or a subordinate individual in the group's hierarchy? So individuals in that sense seem to have a notion of their own position in the hierarchy. So to that extent, they are aware. To that extent, they seem to have some notion, and I don't want to use the word notion because it's a loaded term, but they seem to know I am dominant or I am not dominant. I can do this much, but I cannot do that much, right? And so that, I think, automatically suggests that there is a rudimentary level of self-awareness. How it manifests in other domains and in which other ways is something that we need to explore. I will give you a second example of something that was completely, extremely surprising and astonishing for me. We've discovered in the Bandipur National Park, where we've been studying macaques now for 18 years, a new phenomenon where female macaques have started moving across groups. And there was one such event when we saw a female leaving her group and walking away with two other individuals who had come there, presumably to look for other troops. She had left her 4-month-old infant on the tree when she got down and left. She walked 2 kilometers along with these other individuals, found another troop, waited there for the next few days, interacting with the members of that group, but staying on the periphery of that group. And then I think about 4 or 5 days later, she walked back with one of those other 2 males she went with. She walked back the entire 2 kilometers. She climbed the tree. She collected her infant. And within 10 minutes, she got off the tree and walked back to that group with her infant. And till this day, she lives in that new group, right? Now, why did she leave without her infant? Did she forget her infant? Why did she come back after 5 days and pick her up? And it was very clear. She comes back, picks up the infant, within 10-15 minutes, she's going back again. She's taken a very definitive decision. So clearly this calls for planning ahead. She most probably did not take her infant because she did not know the dangers of where she was going. Once she found a group, she took a decision to come back, collect her infant and go back and join that. That is an extremely complex decision. I will never be able to publish this because n is equal to 1 and natural sciences doesn't like non-repeatable, one-off, unique events. But I think it's important to think about these behavioral decisions, and when an animal does this, I do not know whether she is as conscious as you or I are, but she definitely is aware of the world in ways that we have never thought animals could be. So I think there is a certain level of cognitive sophistication, whether that borders onto consciousness or not is a different matter, but which characterizes these animals. And why should it not be so? For millions of years they have evolved in a complex environment, physically and socially. They take complex decisions. Why should they not be conscious?